Hello and welcome back to Over My Dead Pod. I'm your host, Holly Spear.
This is Kate Carter.
And I'm Kylie Colwell.
Today is my case, and this week we're looking at the oldest unsolved case of Arkansas, which is the case of Pauline Storment, a dedicated University of Arkansas student whose life was tragically cut short just steps away from her apartment. A killer stalked and brutally killed Pauline in public and then disappeared into the night, never to be found again. This is Pauline Stormont's story.
I was talking to my dad. He's like, "Oh, whose case is it today?" I was like, "Holly." He goes, "Is it going to be an Arkansas case?"
You know it.
Oh, and of course it's unsolved too. My fave.
Yeah, I know. The oldest, which this is a case from the 70s. So that kind of surprised me. I would have thought that the oldest unsolved would be even older, but
Yeah, I would have thought that too. That's actually, I was thinking much before that.
yeah, definitely. So Pauline was born in Ozark on April 3rd, 1944, and her family would say that Pauline was a very serious and quiet child, which I feel like is kind of an odd description for a child. But she was just always very studious. She loved to learn, she loved school. So kind of makes sense. As Pauline got a little bit older, she got to high school, and her family would say that she stayed the same. She wasn't a partier, she wasn't a drinker. She went to school, she studied a lot, and she loved to learn. When she graduated high school, she decided to attend Arkansas Tech University in Russellville, which, by the way, is my hometown and also where I got my undergraduate degree.
Whoop whoop.
Shout out. Um, but Pauline went there only for her freshman year because she then took a break and started working instead of school. So Pauline grew up to be a very pretty and polished young woman. So it was no surprise when June 4th, 1944, when she was 21 years old, she married a man named Charles Joseph Pate. And oddly enough, not much is known about Joseph or the two's relationship. All we know is that during the marriage, at some point, they both moved to Memphis, Tennessee. And this is when Pauline decided to take off from school and just work instead. So while they lived there, Pauline worked as a secretary and taught first aid at the Red Cross. Joseph and Pauline's marriage didn't last very long, though, before they separated. And kind of just like their marriage that we don't know much about, there's not much known about their separation either, or why they decided to separate. Sometime after the separation, Pauline moved back to Arkansas and re enrolled herself back into school. This time, she decided to go to the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, and she's going to major in social welfare, and she's 27 at this time. While at the U of A, Pauline worked two part-time jobs. One was a cashier at the Malco Theater, and the other as a secretary at the ROTC Center at the school. So Pauline also had a roommate when she was going to school here, and her roommate was named Alice Murphy, who also described Pauline much like her parents described her, very focused on her schoolwork. She's not interested in dating anybody or partying. And most of the time, she could be found at the library or at class or just studying. April 12th, 1971, she worked a shift at the ROTC Center, and then she told her coworker that she may later go to a gospel concert. Pauline went to the library that night, and then she left around 9:30, and she started walking back towards her apartment. It was dark by this point, and Pauline was alone, and she's carrying a bunch of heavy textbooks like stacked on top of each other in her arms. And she's walking down Duncan Avenue. And this is not a desolate road by any means. This is a college town. It's right on or outside of campus, and it's very highly trafficked. And it's dark, but there's still people walking around, driving by, and there's apartments nearby as well. And people had their windows open that night because it was pretty hot outside. Pauline was only a few blocks to being back at her apartment. But as she walked down the sidewalk, Pauline didn't notice that she was being followed. A man was stalking her, lurking just steps behind her. Suddenly, this man in the shadows would do something that made Pauline turn around to face him. He would pull out a knife and stab Pauline quickly, 8 times. The attack lasted at least a couple of minutes. Pauline let out a blood-curdling scream and collapsed to the ground. People in the area could not help but hear the scream. While the perp disappeared into the night, passerbyers rushed to her aid. No one actually saw Pauline actively get stabbed. They just saw the man behind her, and there was witnesses that heard her scream and fall to the ground, but no one actually saw her get stabbed. Someone called the police, and Pauline was rushed to Washington Regional Hospital. Doctors did everything that they could to save the life of Pauline. They worked on her for about an hour and a half, but unfortunately, at 11 p.m. that night, she was pronounced dead. Her last words were, "Don't hurt me." While Pauline was at the hospital, police were doing everything that they could to find a lead. Police had actually arrived within minutes of Pauline being stabbed, so they thought that their chances of catching the killer, like still running on foot, were pretty good. So obviously, police start with the witnesses. There's 4 witnesses altogether that either heard Pauline scream or saw Pauline walking down the road before she was stabbed. Witness number 1 was Jack Huff. During the attack, Jack was at his apartment right above where Pauline was stabbed, and he had his window open, which is how he heard Pauline scream at 9:45 p.m. Now, unlike almost every story that we've told on this podcast, this witness heard the scream and ran towards the sound. Odd.
I would do that.
I bet you would, but most of our witnesses, like, they hear a scream and they just, like, I don't know, go back to bed or
Right.
doing what they are doing. And just then when the police are like, "Hey, did you hear anything weird?" They're like, "Yeah, I heard a blood-curdling scream at 3 a.m." And they're like, "Oh, okay."
It sounded like my
Thanks.
neighbor was getting stabbed, but I chalked it up to the floorboards.
Right. And they're like, "Yeah, your neighbor was
You're like,
being."
okay.
Yeah. So Jack runs downstairs to see who's in distress. When he arrived, he saw Pauline, and she was actually still upright and staggering towards him, holding her stomach. She collapses, and Jack is like trying to decipher all this. He's trying to beg her, like, "Please tell me what happened. Like, who did this to you?" Jack said that Pauline was able to tell him that someone hit her in the chest, someone that was following her, and that he was wearing glasses. Witness number 2 was Mike Adair, who lived nearby the crime scene. Mike did not see or hear the attack, but he actually saw Pauline before the attack, and he remembers seeing her walking down the road as he was driving by. He says he passed her, and just as he was rounding the corner of Duncan and Center Street, which was right about where she was attacked, he noticed that there was a man behind her. Now, I don't know if Mike thought anything was like sinister about the man behind her, or he just remembered that there was like a woman and then a man behind her. I kind of think, just like based on the articles that I read, that there was nothing, like, no one picked up on it being weird that there was a man behind her. He just kind of like fit in. So witnesses 3 and 4 are Gary Grammel and Joe Clifton. Gary and Joe were both driving down Duncan Street, and they're in separate cars, so they're not like together or anything. But both of them said that they passed Pauline walking. They also remembered seeing a man behind her. And Joe would say that he remembered Pauline because she looked like she was carrying, like what she was carrying, her books were really, really heavy. And he even thought about stopping and asking if she wanted a ride, but then just decided it wasn't a good idea. And right after passing Pauline, he heard a shrill scream and heard Pauline cry out, "Help me." At this time, both Gary and Joe looked in the direction and saw Pauline hold her chest and drop to the ground as if someone had punched her. Neither Joe or Gary saw the man or the actual attack. They both parked their cars and ran to Pauline's aid. She was laying half in the street and half on the grass, with all of her books spread out in disarray around her. One of her arms was completely soaked in blood. Joe asked Pauline if the guy that was walking behind her did this to her. She was able to tell him yes. Joe frantically asked Pauline where the rest of the cuts were and where the man went. Before she could answer, Pauline became disoriented and was drifting in and out of consciousness. She kept asking for people to hand her books. So she's kind of like going out of consciousness at this point, but she's still a little bit awake. From Pauline's autopsy, investigators learned that Pauline was definitely killed due to her stab wounds to her arm, chest, and stomach. She was stabbed 8 times with a large butcher knife that was about 6 to 8 inches long, and it was serrated on both sides. All of Pauline's stab wounds were on the front of her body, and this meant that if the attacker was following Pauline from behind, like the witnesses reported, this would mean that Pauline would have turned around to face her attacker before she was stabbed. Police wondered if it was someone Pauline knew. Would she have turned around to talk to somebody, or was this just a surprise attack? Was it targeted, or was the attacker just targeting vulnerable women walking alone at night? So at the scene, police find Pauline's purse and they check it for fingerprints and found that there was only one set of prints on the purse and they were Pauline's. This was also a factor to add to the story because by this, they kind of started to figure out that this attack was not like a robbery gone wrong. Like someone didn't grab her purse and then she resisted the attack and or the robbery and then they killed her. The purse was still there with the wallet inside. No money was missing, nothing, no fingerprints. This attack was just too up close and personal. Police were unable to find anyone that actually disliked Pauline. She seemed to have no enemies. Her roommate, Pat, said that she wasn't dating anyone either, no one that she knew about. She was only focused on her studies. A few days later, investigators found a large butcher knife matching the one from Pauline's wounds. It was found behind an apartment complex across the street from where Pauline lived, which is obviously where the attack happened because she was just a few blocks from her apartment. The knife was sticking up out of the ground, so it was like somebody had like stabbed it into the ground and left it there. Police sent it in for testing, and then we don't really hear anything back. We don't know if we don't know if any evidence was found on the knife or if it matched the knife from the scene. Investigators didn't really seem convinced that this was the knife that was used. And we don't really know anything else about it. We don't know if it's still in evidence, if it's been lost. I read a lot of articles that suggested that there's been a lot of evidence lost in this case. I don't know if the knife is one of those things, but there's a lot of reports that the knife was found and that police didn't think it was connected, but then really nothing to back that up either way. Pat, the roommate, was asked if anything suspicious happened that day, anything out of the ordinary. Pat said, actually, yeah, around 2 p.m. that day, two young white men that neither Pauline or Pat knew approached them and invited them out for drinks. Pat and Pauline declined. Also, something of note was that her coworker at the ROTC office, Terry Keating, told police that Pauline was talking about possibly going to a gospel music concert after work. It was being held at the Union Ballroom on campus. The group singing was called the Black Americans for Democracy. The concert would have started at 8 o'clock p.m., and this was very close to the ROTC building. Now, we don't actually know if Pauline stopped by the concert after work or if she just went straight to the library instead. It's not known or reported if she actually attended. I will add, I've also seen a couple people theorize that Pauline, being a white woman going to a black concert, might have ruffled some feathers in Arkansas in the 70s, but there's really no evidence to suggest that this was a factor in Pauline's attack at all. But just throwing that out there. Either way, we know that she was seen at the library later and left the library around 9:30. And that in itself is a little bit odd. Pat, the roommate, said that when Pauline went to the library, her routine was to not come home until about 10:30 or 11. They had lived together for a while, and Pat just knew Pauline's routine every day. So, yeah, Pauline would leave the library at 9:30 and she would be attacked at 9:45. So police start theorizing, did something or someone make her leave early? Was someone making her uncomfortable? Was she going somewhere other than home? Something made her deviate from her schedule that day.
I've been known to leave the library a little bit earlier than I should have. Like, is
Yeah,
it too weird?
I don't think it's super weird at all. Like, it's probably something I wouldn't have noticed, but somebody close to her was like, that's weird. So I guess police just like take that for what it's worth, like someone close to her thinking that it's odd. But maybe if she's like so strict that she literally like gets home like between 10:30 and 11 every single day. I don't know. Police look into Pauline's ex-husband and they find out that Pauline had an old roommate when she lived in Memphis. Like after she and her husband separated, she lived with a roommate for a while. And this roommate said that Pauline had said she was actually very scared of her ex-husband. For whatever reason, police were very quick to rule him out. No reason was actually reported on why he was ruled out so quickly, but we know that he did attend the funeral and that he was questioned by police. He was very cooperative and he was ruled out very early.
Was he still in Memphis? Is that why?
Possibly. I didn't say that, but maybe he had a airtight alibi of being in Memphis, and I don't know. The 4 witnesses were asked to come to the police station to answer more in-depth questions. The witnesses were able to tell police that the man was wearing a brown sports coat and had blonde or dirty blonde hair. He was about 6 feet tall and he wore glasses. Police were able to do a sketch of the suspect, and all the witnesses evaluated the sketch and were able to say that it was pretty close to the man that they had seen. They said that actually, though, the man's hair was a lot messier, and the photo or the sketch showed it more slicked back than it actually was. So let's talk about 2 other witnesses. Police had found Robert Spray and John Hall, who lived nearby on Hill Street. And they say that they saw a man that matched the other witnesses' description of the man fleeing. This man was also wearing a sports coat and he was medium height, and he was walking but kind of stumbling around like he might have been drunk. And police find these 2 witnesses, or maybe not witnesses, but police find these 2 men that had seen a guy that looked like them, because now they're like passing around this police sketch that they have. And then 2 people who live nearby are like, oh, we saw a guy that matched that description last night. One of the things about this was like the guy that they reported didn't seem to report that he had any blood on him, and police were kind of speculating that because this stabbing was so close, like 8 times face to face, there's no way that the attacker wouldn't have had blood like all over them. So, I mean, unless he like changed his clothes or like threw his clothes off. So, yeah, police hadn't seen anybody covered in blood, but that was until 40 minutes later when police were cruising the area and they saw 2 young men sitting on a bench with a car parked on Dixon Street. They were 4 blocks away from the scene. One was 17-year-old Walter Peter Kunkle. Officers pull over and ask the boys what they're doing, to which that they reply that they're just hanging out, and they were actually supposed to have double dates with 2 girls, but were stood up at the last minute. Police asked what the girls' names were, to which the boys reply that they just don't know. Odd. You don't even know their names, but police noticed that Peter actually has dark brown stains on his jacket and white shirt. The officer asks Peter why he has blood on his clothes, and Peter tells the officers that he had a nosebleed earlier. Now, the reports don't say if this is a lot of blood, which drives me crazy. It doesn't say if he was covered in blood, if it was blood splatter, if it was just like 1 drop of blood, 1 drop of blood here. Like, we don't know. So the police take the boys in for questioning, and they also take Peter's clothes and samples of his own blood so that they could see if it's really this nosebleed that he's talking about. So they're going to test this blood. Now, let's keep in mind that this is the 70s, and all they're really able to do is tell the blood type. Even more unfortunately, Peter and Pauline are both type A blood. So it's kind of pointless to test the blood. In addition, blood samples were reported to be too small to even test. So that makes me assume that the blood that police are talking about on Peter's jacket is not
It could
the
have been
blood.
from a nosebleed.
It could have been, because
Yeah.
for them to say the sample's too small to test, that makes me think that he's not covered in blood.
Also, if he had just committed a murder, I don't think he'd be sitting on a bench a couple
Just
blocks
chilling.
away.
Yeah, just like watching it all go down.
No.
So, despite this, Peter's actually arrested for the murder, but he gets an attorney, and the attorney smartly says that Peter will not be taking a polygraph. And this is significant because in the 70s, this was like a huge investigation tactic. Like, cops were giving polygraphs like left and right, and they used it as a bigger factor than they do today. Like, I feel like if people passed a polygraph back then, they'd be like, oh, they're clear, like no need to keep looking at them, or, vice versa. Peter did give a statement to the police, and he said that on the night that Pauline was killed, he and his friend were doing speed. So speed was a really popular drug at the time for young people. And just for some background, speed is amphetamine. And in fact, in 1965, the Food and Drug Administration limited amphetamine to prescription use. So as you can imagine, people were still like, it was still a very common thing to do. So anyways, Peter claims that the 2 boys spent their day shooting up drugs, and said that they took some at around 7:30 p.m. and then again at around 8. Peter then stopped at a store called the Jet Set to get a drink. Then a friend named Richard Finley, who he was with that day, asked him to give him a ride home. So he borrowed another friend's motorcycle and gave Richard a ride. Coincidentally, their route to take Richard home would have put them right at the avenue of the crime scene at about the same time that Pauline was killed. Peter claims he then dropped Richard off at his home and then went back to the place where he was staying. Peter's lawyer then makes a deal with police that Peter would submit to a polygraph if police would agree that if he passed, he would be cleared of all charges and police would basically leave him alone. Which I didn't know that was a freaking thing. Like, you can just make a deal with police before you're even it wasn't a trial thing. It was just like an investigation thing. Like, he'll take a polygraph. If he passes, clear him and leave him alone. So
That's super risky.
yeah, it's like, what detective made this decision? Maybe they got fired. I don't know. I will add that they didn't really have much probable cause to arrest Peter in the first place. So maybe cops are like, yeah, we'll take our chances. Because, I mean, they have this blood on Peter and he was around the crime scene at the same time. But this is also like a big campus and there was lots of people that saw it happen or were in the area and didn't see, whatever. But they don't really have any concrete evidence against Peter. So maybe police are like, okay, we're going to take a gamble on this. So Peter takes the polygraph and he passes. So the police chief stays true to his word and makes a statement that police are satisfied that Peter had no part in the murder of Miss Storment. I'm not saying that Peter did it, but at this point, I don't know. I think it's kind of weird that they would do that. I don't think that's enough to clear him just because he passed the polygraph. I don't think he should be arrested either, but keep looking into it, but whatever. I'll also say that none of the witnesses that saw the attacker, that saw his face, they didn't see the killer's face very well, but none of the witnesses were comfortable testifying that Peter was the man that they saw. And this is weird, but Peter and his parents hold their own press conference. And at this press conference, Peter claims that he does not blame the police, that he always knew he would be cleared because he's innocent and he had nothing to do with Pauline's death. And investigators move on, just like they said they would. And they do more interviews, more lie detector tests of people that they're interested in, people that lived in the area, and people that knew Pauline. But Pauline's case kind of came to a standstill. This was until another U of A student was stabbed, Andrea Jones. Andrea had a guy over at her apartment named Eddie Rush. And the apartment was actually 1.8 miles from where Pauline was attacked. Eddie was not a student. And then I don't really know what happened in the course of the night, but Eddie ends up stabbing Andrea several times. Thankfully, though, Andrea would live through the attack, and Eddie was quickly arrested and sentenced to 21 years in prison for the attack. Police and the public couldn't ignore that Pauline's case was very similar and the similarities of Eddie and the police's sketch of Pauline's attacker.
Compared to the other guy, I think he does look more similar to the sketch.
Yes, agree.
Yeah, the other one doesn't make any sense.
No.
I'll say the one sketch without the glasses, it looks like an older man.
Eddie Rush recently passed away, and there's no evidence to test in either, there's no evidence in Pauline's case to test against Eddie's. So they're just similar cases, and there's never really been any link. May 22nd, 1981, a man named Jack Butler walks into the Fayetteville Police Department and says he has something to tell police. He said that he murdered Pauline Storment. Jack tells police that he was just hanging around campus at the swimming pool on April 12, 1971. He then decided to go home, grab his pocket knife, and then start strolling through a cemetery nearby. This is when he saw a woman walking in front of him whom he thought was his wife. So he followed her and then stabbed her 3 times from behind. He said that he didn't realize that the woman was not his wife until he got home and his wife was at home. Later, he realized, yeah. I think this might be another one of the speed cases, possibly. I don't know. Later, he said he realized that the woman he stabbed must have been Pauline Storment. Police are pretty quick to say that they don't think that this man is the killer. And there's a few reasons. His story is just very inconsistent with what happened in Pauline's stabbing. First of all, it wasn't even the same location. Second, Pauline was stabbed from the front, and he says that he stabbed this woman from behind. He says that he stabbed this woman 3 times, and Pauline was stabbed 8. And he also says that this woman's was carrying a record player when he stabbed her. Pauline was carrying books. I mean, I don't know. Also, he stabbed her. He said he stabbed with a pocket knife, and we know that Pauline was definitely not stabbed with a pocket knife. I don't know. This was a weird confession because there are some things that it's like, were you on drugs and you thought that this was what was happening and it was not? Or are you just like falsely confessing and you're weird? I don't know.
I would love to know what his wife said after she heard about this.
Yeah. I hope she left. Like,
Yeah.
I hope that she's an ex-wife now. So police quickly decide that this is a false confession and don't really spend any more time on Mr. Jack Butler. The case of Pauline Storment unfortunately goes cold. A magazine called Master Detective published an article about the killing in 1980. The magazine publisher's office got an anonymous letter mailed back to them. The letter said that Pauline's murder was a case of missing identity. The killer thought that she was someone else. The letter didn't have a name, nor were there any fingerprints on the letter. Law enforcement checked, but it was postmarked Capron, Virginia. And this is at least worth noting. Capron, Virginia is where there is a correctional facility called the Southampton Correctional Facility. There were some inmates there who were friends with Peter Kunkle. In addition, Joe Clifton, he was one of the witnesses, was also incarcerated there for some time. So people started asking, maybe Peter got turned down on that date, he got high, and then he killed Pauline, thinking that that was the girl that stood him up. They're just kind of like putting together theories because of this letter. I don't know. There's that. There's obviously some more theories that people have talked about online. And one of them was a murder that was people started thinking was similar to Pauline's. And this was the murder of Betsy. Oh, I'm going to butcher it. Aardsma. And she was stabbed at a library in Penn State University in 1971. Now, Betsy was stabbed in the actual library, and we know that Pauline was stabbed quickly after leaving the library. But proponents of this theory point out the fact that Pauline usually stayed later at the library, and maybe something made her leave early. People start to ask if it could have been something sinister that made her leave. Both of the killers wore glasses, but that's about it to support this theory. Honestly, it's not very solid, but just worth mentioning at least. Others look at Ted Bundy because he was, of course, in this time period, and every unsolved case gets blamed on Ted Bundy. But people say Bundy had family in Arkansas, and he did come through from time to time. But, you know, it is what it is. People think he's connected to every case.
He did like college girls.
True, he did.
I guess that's about it.
College girls, and he has family in Arkansas. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe in a few years we'll see that he has another victim, but I don't think so. Some wonder if this could have been just a random serial killer, someone who was in town and was able to quickly and quietly stalk and kill Pauline and then disappear into the night. But others speculate that this was a crime of passion, someone close to Pauline, someone who was around her age because he fit into the scene, since no one really thought much of the man walking behind her, and that he knew Pauline because this was obviously an up-close and personal killing. Then in 2024, the cold case unit closed the case. It's no longer open, but it's also still unsolved.
I don't think they should be allowed to do that.
I know.
There's a lot and a lot of things to investigate, and you can't investigate every case every day for decades, but leave it open at least.
Yeah. Like, why? Why would you close it? It just doesn't really make that much sense to me.
They really must have nothing.
Yeah, I think they have literally nothing. So, what we do know is that on South Duncan Avenue in Fayetteville, Arkansas, April 12th, 1971, Pauline Storment was brutally stabbed, and her life was taken in the prime of her life. And the killer got away and disappeared into the night and got away clean. The suspect was about 6 foot tall with glasses. Okay, Pauline's maternal grandfather's first cousin
Okay, okay, okay.
Yeah. His name's Lance Goswell, and he actually runs a website and he posts a lot. I got a lot of my sources or a lot of my source material from his posts because he's FOIA'd all these documents and posted them online relating to her case, which is super helpful. But he's been a big proponent of people continuing to talk and look at her case. So check out his website. I mean, it's still possible that this case gets solved. Somebody somewhere knows something. There was a quote from someone in law enforcement talking about this case that was posted. I thought it was kind of sad, but it was still like something that was possible. And he said that at the moment, only a deathbed confession or a secret diary hidden away in an attic, basement, or Bible will close this case. But there's still hope. If you know or someone else knows anything about the murder of Pauline Storment, you can contact the Arkansas police or anybody.
Anyone.
Um,
You can contact us,
you
we'll,
can
we'll help
contact
you out.
us, contact the police, and then contact us and like let us know.
Yeah.
But anyways, yeah, there's still hope. And that was the case of Pauline Storment.
That's so sad. That's a really sad case. Yeah.
Mhm.
I don't think it was, what's his name? Is it Peter?
Yes, Peter.
Peter. Okay, I don't think it was Peter. I think the like date thing, like those girls just didn't exist. Like that was just an excuse. Like that's why we're doing drugs in the park or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, it is weird though that, you know, independently two people talked about going on dates, two double dates, like her roommate was interviewed by police and they asked her if anything weird happened and she was like, well, two guys approached us and asked us if they wanted to go on a date, and then we have these two boys found 40 minutes after the attack and they were like, oh well, we were supposed to go on to a double date and we got stood up. So it is kind of weird, but also could definitely just be a coincidence and an excuse for those boys just sitting in the park doing drugs. So yeah.
Which is, I
Also,
hate.
that other case of Betsy getting stabbed in the library, I
Yeah.
started looking into that one. I was like, okay, here's crazy. She was stabbed in the library. No one heard it.
What?
She must have the first stab wound must have
Yeah.
impacted her in some type of way then. You
I mean,
know?
yeah, and what? Like the killer got away with that because his first like stab
Yeah.
did that. Like that's crazy. It was freaking silent library. Like
Yeah, that is weird.
insane.
You guys want
Anyway,
to jump into overtime?
overtime.
I do have a case update.
Oh,
It's not one of our cases though, but it's a case that happened this year. And so I wanted to give you guys a little bit of tea about it. Because the trial for this case started this past weekend. So
okay.
like it's going to be in the news. I'm pretty sure it is an open trial right now because we're learning everything about it as it goes. So that pretty much it's open. And plus there's tons of people there and family members. I don't know. Do you guys remember it was at the beginning of this year? It was like in February that runner at the University of Georgia, a girl, her name was Laken Riley. She
Yeah.
was, yeah,
Okay.
she was like beat with a rock and then strangled. She was 22 years old and she had gone from a run from her residence on campus and was found like at the trail on campus. Let's just say her roommate called the cops at noon. They found her body at like 12:30. Like it was very quick turnaround kind of thing. Well, the whole issue outside of her being murdered in general was they pretty much immediately found evidence and were able to link it to an illegal immigrant. And then the illegal immigrant, his name was Jose. He was also very young. He was in his 20s. He had been arrested a few times in the US. He had been like in the US for like a year. If I remember this correctly, he crossed the border illegally, was detained, and then let go for some reason, but wasn't like let go back in Mexico, was like let go back in the US. And then he committed like 3 or 4 crimes, but for some reason, one or the other was not sent to jail, was not kicked out of the country. Like this became, if you guys can remember, this became like a really big immigration like talk this year when it came to the politics, just because the election was happening and everything. But as the background for Laken, the trial started this weekend against Jose, and he was charged with 10 different counts. And I wrote down the counts, so I'm going to say them to you because some of them I'm a little interested about. So, malice murder, 3 counts of felony murder, which that's the one that kind of confuses me. Kidnapping with bodily injury, aggravated assault with intent to rape, aggravated battery, obstruction with a person making an emergency call, tampering with evidence, and peeping Tom. So I do want to say the intent to rape, I think her clothes were found off, but no sexual trauma had existed. And then the obstruction with a person making an emergency phone call, she had a smartwatch on. And so when she started to get attacked, apparently either she or the watch did it herself, that it called 911. The watch calculated when her heartbeat stopped. So she was on the phone with 911 the entire time, and then her heartbeat stopped at like 9:28. The attack started at 9 or something like that. Yeah. So which is
Wow.
crazy, but also shows you, the importance
Wow.
of some, technology. We don't always give credit to it. But and then the whole peeping Tom charge, because I didn't know this one. I had to look this up. Apparently he committed this murder, Jose, and then later on on campus, he broke into one of the in housing units on campus, and one of the girls there called 911, like campus 911, because some guy was like trying to look through her window. We'll see how this goes. I feel like it's going to go pretty quickly. There's a ton of evidence against him. Like I said, they were able to find like a lot of evidence nearby and whatnot, his fingerprints and everything. And then the last thing that is pretty important on this case too is that her murder happened at the end of February, and I think by the end of March this year, the Laken Riley Act was passed in Congress. And so, which is, as you guys know, that's a really quick turnaround for any act to get passed. But it was an immigration act, and it's requires federal detention for any migrants who commit burglary or theft. And apparently, that is what Jose had been arrested for prior, when he was still an illegal alien in the country and never got in trouble for it. So
Wow.
not good, but I'm glad that justice is obviously going to be served. And in this case, because we don't hear this at all, it was a really quick turnaround.
Yeah.
Like they found him immediately. They had all the evidence. Her body was found pretty quickly from 911, same day. We don't hear that. And then the fact that like we're having the trial right now, it's November 17th, and she was killed in February. That also, we don't hear that quite often either.
Yeah.
Usually it takes a
Yeah.
while for the trial to start. So that is my update for today.
I knew the case, but not that well, or anything about the Apple Watch. That's disturbing.
Yeah, that
Crazy.
they just said that in trial. So I found that out too, because I was like, that's really, because I
Wow.
remember seeing a charge that was like tampering with the obstruction of like calling, 911 or something. And I was
Yeah.
like, did she call 911? That's pretty,
Yeah.
you don't ever hear that too often. So the whole watch thing is really cool.
Yeah. No, it is. It's kind of like eerie and cool at the same time.
Yeah. So I'll keep you guys updated on that.
Yeah.
I assume it'll be a pretty quick outcome.
When did the Idaho 4 case trial start?
I think
Trials.
it's next June
Oh,
is the
yeah.
goal.
Yeah. I assume it's going to be postponed.
Yeah. Probably so.
Have they changed the jurisdiction for that?
I think so.
They've had to, right? There's no way it's in the same town.
I thought that they already did change it.
I think they moved it to the capital.
Okay.
Okay.
That case is going to be nuts. I fully anticipate for all of our listeners that one of us will cover that at some point.
Oh,
once we get all the evidence out and everything. Like that's, yeah.
Do you think it's going to be a public trial?
I don't know.
I don't think so.
I think it's too mainstream.
Let us in.
I know. I'm kind of shocked that the Laken case was, but then again, it's pretty plain cut with all the evidence.
Yeah. Also, like, I mean, with all the immigration stuff happening,
yeah,
I feel like a lot of people want it to be public.
Yeah. I wish all cases were public.
Me too.
Yeah. I get the importance of it though.
All right. Well, and with that, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Over My Dead Pod. If you liked this case, share it with your friends. Hit that like button and follow us on YouTube. And also, we have video now, so you can see our faces. So follow us on YouTube if you want to see what we look like, and like all of our videos. And follow us on Over My Dead Pod on Instagram. And we will be back next week with another case. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.